Yeah, as Catherine says, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming along. Talking about the changes that happened in Howth in the early 20th century, it's really only happening over about 2 years between 1909 and 1911. The castle has been there 800 years, but the time in which this change takes place is really the biggest overhaul that it ever went in its history. And so it's interesting to go through that. And throughout this, I'm going to be showing, be of interest hopefully to all of you, but particularly those from Howth or familiar with Howth, some photographs of the castle during this time that have never been published or never been really released out into the public sphere before. And so I thought it'd be interesting to include some of those in here as well. When I was doing my master's thesis on this exact period of the castle, really diving quite deep into the details of it, and it's only this year, if you were to go into the Irish Architectural Archive, you'll start to find a number of documents relating to this time in Howth Castle. They've only ended up in there this year, having been in a private collection for the last 100 years. So it's interesting, that this is all just coming to light now. And so I thought I'd show off a little bit while we're here. But again, many of you are probably familiar with the location of the castle, just at the entrance to Howth village, on the right-hand side, and where Deer Park is today. It's been there as a castle since 1235. The family, the St. Lawrence family, which has been the family home of all throughout its history, first came to Howth in 1177 as a Norman family, the first leading figure of the family being a Norman warrior by the name of Almeric Tristram. And again, the Norman invasions of Ireland from 1169 onwards, the story gets to Howth in 1177, and Almeric ultimately becomes the first Lord of Howth. Throughout the generations, as the castle is first built in the 1230s and expanded by nearly every new generation of the family, it grows and grows and grows to its current condition. So before we go into some of the 20th century alterations, I'll be talking about some of the 18th century work on the house as well, because it changes most of all in its history in the early 20th century, but also quite a lot in the 18th century as well. So before we do talk about how it begins to change from 1909, it'd be important to sort of paint a picture of what it looked like before the changes started to take place. We'll go through some photographs of during the process of it changing, and then have a look at it afterwards, what it still looks like more or less today, to go through that. But as Catherine says, you had in 1909 the death of the last Earl of Howth, William St. Lawrence, who was the fourth Earl of Howth. And when he dies, as you say, he's a bachelor, no children. It passes down to his nephew by the name of Julian Gaisford. And so Julian is the man who makes all the changes through Edwin Lutyens to the castle at that time. This is a photo, a painting of the house. It's quite a famous one of the house, really. It's painted in 1745 by a Dutch painter by the name of William van der Hagen, most likely. He did one for Howth and one for Carton House at about the same time. They both look more or less the exact same. And this is painted in the aftermath of a serious amount of work that's carried out on the house throughout the 1730s. The early Georgian period is really when the castle is dragged out of the medieval period, as it was originally. Not just the castle itself, but the family inside, dragged out of the medieval period and sort of modernised in the 1730s. And the castle is drastically modified to try and match this new lifestyle that they're living. And so you can see, again, if you're familiar with the castle itself, looking on the avenue on the right-hand side here is where you'd come in off the Howth Road into Deer Park. You'd go right past the front of the castle, continuing up the left. The avenue's not there at that stage, but up left to the Deer Park Hotel and to the golf club up there. The castle right at the centre. And again, if you're familiar with it, that's more or less how the house still looks today. The 18th century is an important time for the St. Lawrence family, because not only does the house drastically change in the 1730s, but the status of the family changes. So in 1767, essentially the title gets elevated through the peerage. They become Earls of Howth in 1767. Now, the Earls of Howth really over, say, between 1767 and 1909, the finances aren't huge. The estate is about 15,000 acres, so it's not vast. It's reasonably big, but it's not, comparatively, it's not all that big. And so there's not a huge amount of money in the castle at the time. And so between 1767 and 1909, there is piecemeal development of the house through the generations, but nothing massive between sort of 1730s and then again into 1909. A lot of the money particularly with the third and fourth Earl, the last of the Earls of Howth, was spent on horse racing. That was the main interest, and very little else. Okay? And that's where really all the money was lost, I will say. Okay? They never raced hugely successfully, and so a lot of the money was lost through horses and so on. You can see the third Earl of Howth there depicted on a horse on the left. The biggest win that was ever got through the horse racing in the family was in 1848. A horse called Peep O'Day Boy won gold at the Chester Cup. It's quite a big win, and a bit of prize money comes in. And anywhere prize money does come in, well, you pay to keep the house going, keep it afloat, do a little bit of work and maintenance on it. But with the winnings from the Chester Cup, these gates, which if you visit Deer Park you'll be familiar with, you pass through them on the entrance to the estate. Those gates are built off the winnings of that horse, and they're designed by famous Irish architect Sir Richard Morrison. He had these ones, gates at the entrance to Lismore Cathedral and the gates to the entrance of Portumna Castle in County Galway. All three are the same set. These are those here in Howth. But as I say, there's nothing huge being spent on the house in the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, the house is in pretty bad condition. This is during the time of the fourth, the final Earl of Howth. He takes over from his father in 1874. There's not a huge amount of work being carried out on the house. And the fourth Earl, the last Earl of Howth, decided, well, he wasn't going to stay in Ireland at the end of his life to live in this sort of antiquated and dilapidated castle in Howth. So he spent a lot of his time abroad in the south of France in particular, and in England. He actually died in England eventually in 1909. As was quite fashionable for this sort of practice, if the owner of the house was not living in the house, he would lease it out in many cases. So here's a photograph from August 1897 when the house was on lease to Lord Ashbourne. You could see him there. He's the man sort of standing there. That's Lord Ashbourne. This is during quite an important time in the castle's history. This photograph also shows the Duke and Duchess of York on their royal visit to the house in 1897. They later, of course, become King George V and Queen Mary. You can see them here. So again, Lord Ashbourne is leasing the house at this time. The Earl of Howth is over in France at that stage. What is quite interesting, a little small detail I always like about this photograph of some of the other people that are in it as well. One of them, particularly for those interested in Howth's history, Kilrock House, for a long time lived Lord Chief Justice Gerald Fitzgibbon, and Chief Justice Fitzgibbon is photographed here. But the young girl standing to his right, that young girl there is Lord Ashbourne's daughter. Her name was Violet Gibson, and later in the mid-1930s, I believe it was, she's the woman that tried to assassinate Benito Mussolini. She shot him while he was giving a speech in Rome, and the bullet hit him in the nose, but he survived. And there she is standing at the front entrance to Howth Castle in 1897 while her father was in residence. But again, to show off sort of how bad of a state the castle was in at the time, when Lord Ashbourne first moved in, he was being charged £600 in rent a year to lease the castle. But it had to be reduced down to £500 because most of the castle was starting to fall down and certain wings weren't usable, and so he was using less of it. The rent was slightly reduced. So again, just an idea of really, how bad of a state the house was in at the time. Then in 1909, 12 years later, William Ulick Tristram St. Lawrence, the fourth Earl of Howth, is an easy name to remember, okay? There he is on the left-hand side there. He dies in March 1909. He was 82 years of age. On the right-hand side here is a photograph of his funeral going into the St. Lawrence ancestral tomb in St. Mary's Abbey in Howth Village. Now, when he died, as we've said already, he was a bachelor, never married, and had no children. Of course, importantly, he had no sons. And so the estate and the titles of the family could not be passed down through the male line. They had done for about 700 years at that time. Now, you could have passed the titles sort of left and right through brothers, but the Earl had his half-brother died before him in 1891, Kenelm St. Lawrence. He died quite young, he was only in his 30s. And so there was not really anywhere immediately for the estate, the castle, the titles to be passed. And what ultimately happens, of course, is the title of Earl of Howth, that all dies off with the fourth Earl in 1909. After his death, there was a bit of speculation in many local newspapers as to who exactly was going to inherit the Howth estate, because while he had no surviving brothers, he did have 4 surviving sisters, and so presumably it was going to pass through one of them. Some had married into the Guinness family, some had married into the Weeble family, some had married into the Gaisford family, and they were marrying into other notable families. And so it was going to end up in the hands of one of them. One of the interesting things that was always speculated in the papers at the time is that no matter which one of the sisters it passed through, all of the sisters were Catholics. And so for the first time in the castle's history, it was going to pass out of the hands of Protestants into the hands of Catholic ownership. Now, it was decided that none of the 4 surviving sisters were going to inherit the estate, but instead the Earl's eldest sister, Lady Emily St. Lawrence, she became Lady Emily Gaisford. She was going to inherit the estate even though she had already died. It was going to pass through her line. She had married a man by the name of Thomas Gaisford in 1859. He was a recently converted English Catholic gentleman living on the south coast of England, and that's exactly where the estate was going to pass through her line. Now, herself and her husband Thomas were already dead, but their eldest son Julian was the man that was going to inherit from his uncle, the 4th Earl of Howth. So that's him photographed there on the left-hand side. So here you can see the Times reports a week after the Earl's death on the 16th of March 1909 that it is understood that Lord Howth would be succeeded to the ownership of the Howth estates by his nephew, Mr. Julian Charles Gaisford of Offington in Sussex. Now, just to explain a little bit about it, the house, for those that are living locally in Howth or Sutton, would be familiar with the name Offington. And it was the name of the fine house that the Gaisfords lived in on the south coast of England. But Julian was born in the Gaisford family home of Offington. It was just outside Worthing in Sussex, right down the south coast of England. He was born there in 1862 and had served as a commander of the Royal Navy in the 1880s. He was also very interested in local politics in Sussex during his life as well. He'd served as a Justice of the Peace and so on. He, as a younger man, had married a woman called Bertha Riddle, who lived in Cheeseburn Grange in Northumberland. They married in 1889 and they would have 7 children. Julian himself, there he is photographed in his naval uniform, took a great interest in gardening, farming, book collecting and local affairs, as I say. But following his father's death, Thomas, the man who had married the St. Lawrence woman, merging the 2 families, when he dies in 1898, Julian took over the running of the family estate in Offington in Sussex. They also owned quite a significant amount of land in Wiltshire as well, just a little further north. I'll talk a bit about the state of the castle at that time, but the Gaisfords were a significantly more wealthy family than the St. Lawrences had been. They had made a lot of their money originally in farming and milling in Wiltshire in the 18th century. And when they made their money, they moved into a house called Iford Manor in the mid-18th century, which was in South Wiltshire. Today it's run by the National Trust. It's quite famous for the gardens around it at the moment in particular. And in 1779, one of the most important members of the Gaisford family is born there. His name was Thomas Gaisford. He later became the Regius Professor of Greek and Classics at Oxford University. Was the head of the Bodleian Library for much of his career and later became Dean of Christ Church, Oxford as well. He sort of becomes one of the first notable figures in the Gaisford family. Thomas originally married a woman called, when he married, he had a son, Thomas. He was the man that would later marry the St. Lawrence woman, Lady Emily. Now, Thomas, before he married Lady Emily, was married to a woman called Horatia Fielding. She was a reasonably well-known composer, and she was the half-sister of a man called Henry Fox Talbot, who would become the English inventor of photography, essentially, as opposed to the French side. It's a bit... But Horatia died quite young, and it was then that Thomas married Lady Emily St. Lawrence. He had converted to Catholicism, interestingly, in order to marry her. Usually it would be the other way around. The woman would convert, but Thomas, in fact, converted to Catholicism in order to marry her. She was the eldest daughter of the 3rd Earl and the sister of the final Earl of Howth. Thomas then, later in life, he managed to sell Iford Manor, the house in Wiltshire, and he bought a house down on the south coast of England called Offington Park or Offington Manor, as it's often referred to, and that is where the son Julian was born in 1862. When the 4th Earl of Howth dies in 1909, Julian sold Offington and the land all around it. And he moves over to Howth, brings his family with him, his wife Bertha and their 7 children, all come to Howth to move into the castle and take over the running of the estate from there. Today, if you were to go just outside Worthing, you won't find Offington House there anymore. It was quite a fine, large, early 18th century house, but it was demolished after the Second World War, and there's a sort of a housing development built on it there. One thing I do like, though, is quite near where the house once stood, there's the meeting of two roads. I think one is called Gaisford Road or Gaisford Avenue, and the other is St. Lawrence Avenue or St. Lawrence Road. It's where the two meet. The two signs sort of meet on the corner, so it's sort of Gaisford, St. Lawrence as it wraps around the corner. But as I say, the house is no longer there. Now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the house was in a pretty bad way when Julian Gaisford moved over to Howth. The castle hadn't seen much work done to it really since the 1820s. There was a small bit done in the 1850s, but practically nothing after that. As I say, there were just simply wasn't the money to do it. There's a couple of photographs. These are postcards, in fact, of what Howth Castle looked like at the end of the 19th and the very beginnings of the 20th century. Now, I know I recognise some of you here, you're familiar with the castle and how it looks from the back. It doesn't look like that any longer. This sort of very decorative facade you see on the west wing in the left-hand photograph is all long gone. Later, that's all changed during the 1909 to 1911 alterations. But Sir Richard Morrison, the man who built the gates, was the man who had done quite a lot of work to the facade of the castle in the 1820s, which brought it to this sort of appearance you see in this photograph just here. The latest addition to the house pre-1909 was the building of a tower called Kenlam's Tower, which is named after Kenlam St. Lawrence, and it's right at the end of the east wing. When you're going up towards the Deer Park Hotel, it's the tower you see on the extreme right of the east wing of the house, facing the gate tower. It's on the opposite side of the structure. But there's another closer photograph. Again, this is where the original keep, this part, 15th century part of the castle, meets some of the 18th century work, but it's remodeled to this view in about 1820 by Richard Morrison. But as I say, it doesn't really look like that any longer. Here's a view further back. You can see the west wing again, the sheer wall covered in ivy, the kitchens and so on. You see the cupola sticking up on the left-hand side. That's the kitchen block and so on. But that's how the rear of the castle looked. And if you go up and play a round of golf in Deer Park, when you're teeing off on the first hole back down the hill, that's sort of the view of the house. That's the direction that you'd see at the back of the castle at that time. Here's the inside around that time. It looks a little bit different today, which we'll see in some later photographs. Particularly the fireplace that you see here in the entrance hall has all been completely changed during the early 20th century alterations. Another thing you'll see that's quite famous in the house is that big portrait of Jonathan Swift up there in the top right photograph that was also in the entrance hall at one stage. The drawing room, which is within that 18th century west wing, up on the top left-hand side, and another view of the entrance hall down here on the bottom left. Now, when Julian moves over, so the 4th Earl died in March 1909, Julian almost immediately comes over. He'd visited the house, of course, a number of times during his life. But as the owner of the house, he comes over and sees the terrible state that it's in. The fact that it is quite dilapidated and quite antiquated, and he needs to have it all sort of updated. He had foreseen living a life of extreme sort of Edwardian grandeur in Ireland in his brand new castle in the early 20th century. It didn't last all that long, of course. But what he hears is nearby, on Lambay Island, which many will be familiar with, Cecil Baring, who later became 3rd Lord Revelstoke, was having an old castle rebuilt on Lambay Island by quite a well-known architect at the time, not extremely famous as he later became, but reasonably well known, by the name of Edwin Lutyens. And Julian essentially decides to approach Lutyens, ask him to come to Howth to give some advice on what he should do to Howth Castle to modernise it and make it a little bit bigger. And Lutyens responds that at the moment I'm building gardens at Haywood, which is Haywood House in County Laois, and he was also rebuilding the castle in Lambay. But as he was passing through Howth from time to time, he was happy to stop off and give some advice. He arrives then in the house for the first time in the middle of July 1909, and 6 months later, these appear. Now, these are just two, there's many more, but these are Lutyens' drawings. So January 1910, the drawings are all created. You can see where many of the alterations and additions he was going to make to the house are all outlined now. Well, I was going to say in black and white, it's actually in blue. Anything he was going to add on was put in light blue. But the aim of the work at the time was not simply to make the house bigger. There's no point in making it bigger and bigger and bigger. It looks more impressive, but it had to be modernised, given modern amenities for the early 20th century as well. Later, in the mid-1950s, Julian's son Stephen wrote that at this time, in the early 20th century, the castle had no working indoor toilets, it had no WCs, water closets upstairs, it had no electricity, no central heating, and it, of course, most crucially, it only had 9 bedrooms for staff, most of which they couldn't use any longer. It simply wasn't enough. The Gaisford half of the family were much wealthier, they had a much bigger staff, and they needed somewhere to put them. So not only was the house, in dire need of getting a little bit bigger, but they needed to modernise it, make it a bit more comfortable as well. Now, you see this is on the back of an envelope. This is done by Lutyens' hand as well. It's just a few sketchings on the back. This is a floor plan of the house. So you can see where the sort of stairs are there at the centre, going up to the main block, which is here. Further up then, well, it's north in the direction we're seeing it, but up the top end of the main block then is the west wing, which you see stretching just a little bit further up. That sort of orange box up at the very top there would become one of Lutyens' most major alterations to the house, the building of a brand new tower, later becoming known as the Gaisford Tower. Now, as I say, really needed to rectify those basic issues of putting proper bathrooms, heating, electricity and so on. But the most visually striking sort of aspect of the building was that little orange box that you'll see. I'll show you some photographs on there. This is what he thought that orange box should look like. It was going to be stuck onto the end of the 18th century west wing, a brand new tower. Now, Lutyens was an arts and crafts style architect. What ultimately happens is the tower didn't look like this. All that extra decoration, the sort of terraces, balconies and so on, a little bit French inspired in some ways, that never really comes about. What ultimately became a serious point for Lutyens, a serious point of contention in particular at the castle, was that anything he was doing had to be faithful to the medieval fabric of the building. And so he couldn't really run wild with his own sort of architectural style that he would be used to, but it was very, very constrained, which is why he loved a place like Lambay. So when Lambay Castle was finished, he practically built it from the ground up again and was able to use all his own style, and he was sort of able to run a bit more loose with it, which is probably why he came to visit Lambay nearly every summer for the rest of his life, because it was a project that he absolutely loved. There's no proof of saying it, but he probably wasn't a big fan of working at Howth because he was so constrained and not able to build in his sort of typical style. So the sketch of the new tower here was very important. The main feature of this new tower was to be this library. You can see it, I'll show you a photograph in a minute, but this is again on the back of an owned envelope. It's now in the Irish Architectural Archive. Sketchings of the inside of this new library for the Gaisford-St. Lawrence's. It was particularly important to have a new library put into the castle at that time because the Gaisford half of the family were far more scholarly than the Earls of Howth who came before them. As I mentioned, horse racing was the big thing. Very little else. So they didn't have a huge collection of books. What they did have was sort of dotted around the house in many ways. But the Gaisfords had a huge collection of books. As I mentioned, Julian's grandfather, Thomas Gaisford, was Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford for about 40 years. So most of the books were his. His son then Thomas, and then also Julian, they were all book collectors as well. And so the new library was absolutely essential. When the Gaisfords sold Offington, after inheriting Howth, of course, they wanted to bring their things with them, primarily the book collection, and they needed the new library to house them. Now, they only ended up bringing 1/3 of the collection over to Howth with them. Another third was auctioned off, and another third donated to a religious seminary in England. Many of them are still there. The auction, I have some details of it here. It was held in just after the sale. A considerable portion of Thomas Gaisford's library was sold through Sotheby, Wilkinson and Hodge. Contained a great many books and manuscripts of considerable importance and value. The items of most value were the first 4 folio editions of Shakespeare's plays. Of course, that raises huge money, which is financing some of the building that's going on here. It raised about £10,000, the auction of the books at that time. The sale of the house and the land around Offington also raised about £20,000 on top of that. So there's this big influx of cash which is how they're able to get Lutyens in and do all this work in Howth in the first place. Now, what is of most interest really are these photographs here. These are all photographs in progress, the house being done at that time. Now these, we've often had the Lutyens Trust coming to visit the castle and take tours and things like that. And they've said that many houses that Lutyens worked on have photographs before the house is done by Lutyens and after it's done. So you can compare one to the other. But they haven't come across any that have photographs of the building work in progress like we have for Howth. So again, you're looking at where we saw a few moments ago, the same sort of angles of the west wing and the rear of the west wing down here. It's on there completely covered in scaffolding. You're looking at the inside of the stable, the coachyard just here, and the outside of the kitchen block just up on the top right, completely covered in scaffolding. I'm just going to flick through and show a few more, explain some of the perspectives. This is now shortly afterwards. Again, the work only began in April 1910. This is June, so it's only a couple of months into the process. You're looking at the west wing again, but this time it's not completely empty at the end. You have the beginnings of the new tower with the library at the centre of it that is on its way up at that stage. You start to now see as well the scale of the new tower compared to the rest of the existing building. It was absolutely enormous compared to the existing castle at that time. You see again a little bit further back. This is from where now there's a walled garden out in the back garden here now that Lutyens had properly enclosed. And you see that new tower is really starting to shoot up at that stage as well. But the title of this talk, talking about the ancient pile undergoes improvements, that appears in the Freeman's Journal as a headline during this time, talking about how really the castle was an ancient pile. But when Lutyens comes along, it now starts to undergo quite significant improvements. So here there's another interesting feature, which I'll show another photograph as well, of a new loggia being built, which is sort of a Venetian architectural feature that Lutyens installs. It became quite a practical feature as a foundation to put in new toilets for upstairs and a new boiler for the central heating. He needed to disguise it all somehow, and so creates this loggia. You see it down in the bottom right corner here, the sort of the steps that lead up into the house through the pillars and the archway. Well, it's all quite decorative and quite nice, but really it's to disguise some toilets and a big boiler. He also removed a lot of that very decorative style of the outside of the west wing that Richard Morrison had put on there. He stripped all that away and made it a bit more austere, more plain, again, a little bit more medieval than it had looked previous to that. Here's some more photographs. Again, the bottom left one, you're looking at the Morrison west wing, the facade of it, which is all being stripped away completely. Lutyens also extends the bay window up to double height now. Up on the top left, again, if you're going past the castle, you recognise the front terrace. You can see a couple of labourers there stripping some stone away and doing some repair work to the terrace. Up on the top right is a photograph of what is now the dining room in the north tower inside the castle. It was originally 3 rooms with a bedroom and 2 dressing rooms in it, but Lutyens demolishes the partitions and creates one large dining room on the inside of the house, which you see up there on the top right. Another one that's of interest, I think in particular, the photograph up there on the top left, is Lutyens was always quite a big fan of, making a use of local materials. So the wood and so on that was being used was being cut down through the estate, oak and elm primarily, which ends up furnishing the library. But the St. Lawrence's had other houses beyond Howth as well. One of the other more notable ones was a house called Killester House, which, if you're familiar with Killester, there's a bit of a project being done on that house by Dublin City Council at the moment. But where the domain is in Killester, that sort of housing area, it's known as the domain because it was the domain land around Killester House. It was a dower house for the Earls of Howth, essentially for the wives of deceased Earls. Once an Earl dies, the son inherits with his wife or whatever, his own children, and so the mother would often be posted off to Killester then to kind of get her out of the way, I suppose. And the last, because the 4th Earl had no wife, his mother was the last person that lived in Killester, and she died there in 1884, and the house wasn't really used again after that. So by 1910, when Lutyens is in doing work, Killester House is pretty much completely abandoned. There's a photograph up in the top left of the fireplace in the Great Hall in Killester House. You can see it's completely blackened. It's suffering from a lot of decay and so on. Lutyens decides to rip it out of there, bring it to Howth, and it was installed in the brand new library that he built. It's still there in the castle today. It's just as well because 10 years after that photograph is taken, Killester House burnt to the ground and nothing survives of it today, except for the few things that were taken out by Lutyens and later installed in Howth. So it's quite a significant piece there. So here are some before and after photographs. Again, you'll recognise the one on the left that we took a look at, the pre-Lutyens west wing, which just comes to quite an abrupt end at the end of it with the ivy growing on the wall. Whereas up here, now the one on the far right, you see where that wing has completely changed. A lot of the exterior decoration is gone. And of course you have the brand new tower stuck onto the very end of it. So you have the library was on this floor, just through those 3 windows on the lower level just there. You'll also see, you're now looking in this centre photograph with the west wing on your left side, walking down the little pathway, and you see the beginnings of the loggia that bring you through that archway, up the stairs and into the house as well. Now, Lutyens didn't only make alterations to the building inside and sort of the physical structure of the building on the outside as well, but he did make some changes to the gardens on the outside of the house as well. So the castle was surrounded, which you may have seen in the 18th century painting I showed at the very beginning, was completely surrounded by formal gardens at one point in the 18th century, most of which is long gone now today. But within the confines of the house, the lawn around the house, Lutyens made some changes as well. This here shows the rear of the east wing. On the right hand side you see the finished project with the installation of a brand new sunken garden. The 2 photographs on the left show the beginnings of that when the garden is just being installed at that time. Lutyens, if you know much about him, quite famously worked with a well-known gardener by the name of Gertrude Jekyll, and Jekyll herself never came. He called her Aunt Bumps, old Aunt Bumps. Okay, but Aunt Bumps never came to Howth per se. But a lot of the work that Lutyens does in the gardening around Howth was somewhat inspired by Jekyll. Not the sunken garden necessarily. Jekyll was all about sort of chaotic gardening. It wasn't uniform, no flat sort of rose beds. It was just plants growing at all different heights, all jumbled in together. But some of the features, the stone features of the sunken garden, were inspired by others that he had done with Jekyll during that time. Now, here's sort of the finished product. This is taken just after Lutyens leaves and the house is finished. Again, you're looking at a very tight timeline. The 4th Earl of Howth dies in March 1909. Lutyens first comes in July 1909. The drawings then appear in 1910 in January. The work begins in April, and then the Gaisford-St. Lawrence's moved into the house full-time in the summer of 1911. So it's really only 2 years from Lutyens first getting there to when all of the work is finished. And there's the finished product. So looking at the centre with that one strip of ivy going down the building is the original keep, 15th century. Right-hand side, you're looking down the east wing, which is primarily 17th and 18th century, with Kenelm's Tower on the very right, which is built in the mid-19th century. Going left from the keep, you have the west wing, which is primarily 18th century, but remodelled in the early 19th century, and then remodelled again by Lutyens in the early 20th century. And you have the brand new tower on the very left, which is also early 20th century. So it's a complete mishmash of all different times. You know, it's a bit of layout-wise, it becomes a bit impractical, because they're just sticking bits on here, there and everywhere. You know, in the early 18th century, it would have been desirable for a lot of the medieval castle to be abandoned and a brand new country house built in its place. But the money was never there to do it. So you just have to keep what you have and make it all a bit bigger. Anywhere you possibly can, stick on a new tower, stick on a new wing, and just make the place a little bit bigger anywhere you possibly can. But one interesting point to this is the builder who was in charge of all of this was it was a company called R.E. Mellon and Co. They were based in Rathgar, Brighton Square, out in Rathgar, and there's some detail here about sort of the proposal costs and so on. Mellon had estimated, using Lutyens' architectural drawings, that he would come in and build all of it for him, and it would cost them about £8,500 from start to finish to do all the building work. As I say, it's primarily based off just looking at Lutyens' drawings, sourcing the materials, and so on. Now, at the end of the work, at the end of 1911, Lutyens writes to Julian that the final bill for Mellon's has come through, and it's up at just over £12,000, so pretty much double what they had originally anticipated the work to be, which I suppose is always the case. Look, some things just never ever change. But what Mellon did, again, a brief synopsis, he built the new library wing, the new tower on the very far left there. The library was the most important thing. Of course, having the whole thing plumbed with hot water arrangements and works in connection with staff and servants, allowing them to come into that part of the house now as well. New external steps from the library wing, which you see here on the far left, just there. He also builds the new loggia, which you see sort of at the centre of the house, a little arch with the pillars on the left-hand side there as well, with the heating chamber in the basement and the toilets above it. He took down all the old chimneys, replaced them with brand new ones, and had new flues put all throughout the house. He built a new safe down in the basement and made alterations to the interior of the dining room. He built a number of servants' rooms in the brand new attic spaces that he installed in the house. He had new rainwater drainage throughout the building, electric lights and fittings, and repairs to general dilapidations, as he called it. So you can see how the cost does really seriously begin to rise throughout the house itself. One of the very interesting points, which is rectified shortly after Lutyens leaves, Lutyens hated the appearance of any water drainage systems on the exterior of a building. So be it drains, downpipes, gutters, what have you, hated the look of it. He thought it completely ruined the house. And so what he often did for water drainage would convince the builders to install all of the downpipes and the drains inside the cavity of the walls of the building, which is, of course, a complete disaster. Because if one bursts, you don't know anything about it until all the water comes through the wall, by which stage it's far too late. That was later rectified with some big, heavy metal rain chains that now hang off the outside of the building as well. Now, it wasn't just the physical building work that had to be done. Of course, also the whole house was pretty much entirely refurnished from the ground up. New carpets, new curtains in every room, new bedding, new everything was installed throughout the whole house, as well as all the interior, heating systems and other drainage systems and so on. In total, it came to just over £22,000 all in for all the work that was carried out at the time. It's a huge amount of money that was carried out. Here it is today. That photograph was taken on a much nicer day, only a few weeks ago. So again, you see that the house still looks more or less the same as it did just after Lutyens leaves. You've still got the keep, the original castle in the centre, and then the east and west wings going right and left. And you can see on the right-hand side at the rear of the east wing, the beautiful sunken garden that Lutyens installs at that time there as well. I'm just going to flick through some interior shots as well that were taken in the mid-20th century, just to show you some of the changes of Lutyens' work. This brand new fireplace was installed by Lutyens in 1910, and he had commissioned that beautiful big painting above the top of it. It's hard to really make out what it is, but it is a painting of Howth and a lot of North County Dublin. We don't get quite as far up as here, but it was enough for them at the time. You've got a big wind dial in the middle, which connected to a vane up on the rooftop, and the dial span around to tell you the wind direction outside at one point as well. You'll also see ships on the right-hand side, which are meant to represent the arrival of the Gaisford half of the family to Ireland to take over the Howth estate at that time. But that's in the entrance hall. You have the drawing room, which becomes a lot more almost over-decorated to a sense. They just start because of course when they sell Offington, they have to take everything over with them. Some of it is sold off, but the rest of it they just start cramming into the house. So it becomes a little bit crowded in places in the early 20th century, and all the big palm fronds you see around there as well. Lutyens made pretty much no alterations to that room. It's still more or less 18th century completely. This was the new dining room. It was initially 3 rooms, and I suppose following on from what Cathal would have been saying earlier on, this room is converted into a dining space to increase the efficiency in the house, particularly with the relationship between the staff and the family living in the building. You're sharing the one house, even though it is very big, but it has to work very efficiently for the two to sort of co-inhabit the building. And so the new dining room was the closest possible room to the kitchen, essentially. Initially, the dining room was on the far side of the house. It was completely impractical. Lutyens also installs a series of corridors for the staff to use to avoid going through some of the main rooms in the house, because it was starting to become a bit of a problem with how long the building was really getting. That's the new library. Enormous, as I say, it does house 1/3 of the Gaisford book collection, which they brought over from England with them. Thousands of books kept within the library. in the reading room, and of course in other bookshelves and bookstands, bookcases all around the house as well. It's unusual to say, it's an entirely wooden room, apart from the windows. Pretty much everything else was made of wood, oak primarily, with elm panelling around the room as well. Again, mostly local materials, which Lutyens was a fan of making use of. One other point of interest was this part of the building, because not only did the physical house change, but the dynamic of the family changes as well, because transferring ownership from the St. Lawrence, the Earls of Howth, identifies an Irish family, Protestant family, running the house, not all that interested in religion, but it now hands over to the English Catholic Gaisford half of the family at this time, and they were real Catholics, really staunch, devout Catholics. There was an interview done with the late Christopher Gaisford-St. Lawrence there a couple of years ago, and he talks a bit about his grandmother, Julian's wife, Bertha, and describes her as a Catholic snob. She kept such, the house was run in a very Catholic manner, and particularly over her 4 daughters, she was very controlling of those beliefs. But what they decided to do is have a chapel installed inside the house as well, that Lutyens builds at the end of the east wing. You see a photograph of it there in Country Life on the left-hand side. The chapel was modelled off another work that Lutyens did around that time at Campion Hall in Oxford, in the university there as well. Finally, you see a couple of photographs of them. So on the bottom you have Julian and Bertha just coming down out of the house, down the steps of the loggia into the lawn. Up on the top left you see the 7 children, 3 boys and 4 girls, and on the right hand side you have them all together sitting on the bottom steps of the brand new library tower that's built in 1910. Those of you that are interested in Lutyens architecture may also recognise the style of bench that they're sitting on, which is a Lutyens bespoke designed bench. They call it a Thacum bench or just a Lutyens bench. I always like that you can just see their little terrier dog perched on the up on the top right. You can see him just perched up on the side there, looking over them all in the photograph. But as I mentioned, just to briefly wrap up, Julian in particular, when he has Lutyens in to do all of this, pictures a life of this it's new in an Irish perspective, but this sort of Edwardian grandeur, living in this brand new renovated house, begins hosting all these racing parties, charitable events and so on, with all other sort of Catholic Irish nobility and gentry coming to the house for all these parties. They really only get 3 years out of the house. They move in the summer of 1911, and of course the Great War breaks out in 1914. The 3 boys that you see up in the top left all fought in the war. They were all in British military service, 1 Navy, 2 Army. Luckily they all survive, which of course many families wouldn't suffer the same fate. A lot of the boys are wiped out during the war. But then with the impending revolution that comes and the complete change in the social and political situation in Ireland, all of this over £20,000 of Lutyens' work, really it's only the 3 years that they get out of the house in that lifestyle that they envision. And things, of course, have to change over the last 100 years, which brings the castle to its current situation. But I hope those photographs in particular of the construction work was really what I wanted to show off today, because it is very, very rare for a Lutyens house that you see the work in progress, which is the main thing that I wanted to show off. And for those of you that are passing the castle, you see it from the front, but you don't get an idea looking back on how much Lutyens really did. You don't get the perspective from the front of how big the house really is, because it's very long through the back. And anywhere over the last 100 years, anything describing Lutyens in Howth or any of Lutyens' work, Howth is sort of almost like a footnote. Oh, Lutyens made some minor alterations and additions to Howth Castle, but in fact the work that he did was indeed far more significant than that. Okay, thank you very much.